Okay.
Oh,
So we're gonna start the recording now. Are you ready, Zach?
yes. Hey everyone, welcome back. I hope everyone's doing okay and
You are now
staying
muted.
safe during these times. I know things have been a little bit hectic right now. Anyway, we're gonna go over Kant, Maps, Aristotle, and Wolff today in this presentation. So, can everybody actually see where I'm the slides I'm using right now are on? Okay, cool. I'm seeing that in public chat. All right, so moving on to Kant. The deontology focuses on the right actions at all times. So humans must appear to themselves to be free all the time in all they do. So they must act in the best way they can. Um, so free will plays a huge part in Kant's deontology that we have to constantly choose the right way to act, and we can rationalize exactly how to act in various situations. Um, so one thing he also takes into account is the right intention too. So the right intention for Kant is to act solely out of duty because people ought to do what is right because they know it's the right thing to do. So let's say if you have a case or a scenario where somebody walks across or around and they see a kid drowning in the lake, right? They could go in, save the kid, but then later on realize, or people find out later on that they actually saved the kid just to be able to get like a reward out of the whole scenario. So whereas they might have known that the parents were rich and imagine like, oh hey, I'll get money out of this. For Kant, that's definitely the wrong duty, and that would be the morally wrong thing to do. Another part of Kant's theory is human dignity. Since we're rational creatures, we act with reasons and intentions. So the way we value things makes us valuable in turn because we all have our goals and then ambitions that we want to be able to achieve. So talking more about the categorical imperative. So it's a moral law in which all good, rational actions are consistent and permissible. Failures to follow are impermissible actions. So there can be multiple actions that are permissible, which follow the categorical imperative, just as there are many irrational actions. So he uses the word maxims a lot. It typically refers to as like a personal policy or code of conduct that people, you use it when they act, and we'll get further more into that later. So all people are rational agents are equal. They're all held to the same standard and duty in this whole theory. Um, so everybody else we recognize, everyone has their own needs and wants. We just gotta be able to follow our duties to the right intentions to deciding the right acts. So he introduces three different formulas. So there's formula of universality, which is we always have to act so that your maxim could be used as a universal law that everyone can and should follow. So it has to be possible for people to follow too. Obviously, the goal is to be perfect human beings, to never make any mistakes or hurt others. But again, we all know it's not entirely possible. Um, so the formula of humanity: in all actions, treat others as ends as themselves, not as a mere means to an end. We can he would argue too. It's possible to use somebody else as a means to an end, so long as they are fully aware of everything that's going on around them, so long as they're not being deceived or coerced. Um, the same way that people run businesses, we have workers that willingly work for pay and X amount of hours or under certain conditions. And so he also introduces the formula kingdom of ends. So we always act as though you're the lawgiver of the kingdom. So every action we constantly think of, we have to imagine in our heads, is this something that everybody else should be held to the same standard? Should everyone else also follow this particular standard? So we can take, for example, stealing. Morally permissible to steal. So some people would say there are certain conditions where it's like it would be moral, permissible to steal. Like let's say if a parent has starving kids and you need to be able, steal food to just, feed their kids. To Kant, he would even say that that's morally impermissible because if it's under certain conditions that you can steal, then it has to be under all conditions that someone is allowed to steal. So moving on to sexual morality, so applying Kant's deontology to it. So Kant discusses the role of deceiving or coercing another person. A person ought to be fully informed of the situation if asked for a favor or some sort of deal. Uh, in cases of, let's say, blackmail or somebody's under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or peer pressure, those are all definitely coercing somebody else or deceiving them to commit sexual acts with them. Clearly, that's wrong. So it's morally impermissible to coerce or deceive somebody to use them as a mere means to an end. So again, it's possible to use somebody as a means to an end and still be morally permissible, but just not using them merely as that. I'm trying to slide a switch over. All right, so the liberal theory of sexuality. So Marx doesn't claim that any action is like all actions, even like sexual actions, are fine, even if both parties agree to it, because one person could be deceived or coerced. So it's more than just an agreement; it's being able to know everything that's involved in the agreement. Sexual actions are morally permissible or impermissible the same way any action could be. So it's not really held to a different standard as other acts. Most moral theories all view just action in general as the same thing, or treats it the same way. So it's done, and sorry,
You are
give me
now
one second.
unmuted.
Yes. Can you hear me now? Oh, I'm sorry, guys. Audible? Yeah, definitely. Can you guys hear me now?
You are now muted.
Okay, gotcha. Uh, where was the? I'm sorry. When did it get cut off again? Sorry, when Kant talks about deceiving and coercing. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, just restart this slide.
Okay. Gotcha. So Kant also discusses the role of deceiving or coercing another person. So a person should be fully informed of the situation if asked for a favor or some sort of deal. You can't necessarily just cheat them out of any kind of deal. So there could be cases of blackmail or possibly somebody being under the influence of drugs, alcohol. The idea of peer pressure, saying, "Oh, other people, blah blah, did this, so it's completely normal to do this." Again, sexual acts, that's completely up to the other person if they're comfortable with it or not. And it's morally impermissible to coerce or deceive someone to use them as a mere means to an end. So again, you can still, it's possible to use someone else as a mere mean or as a means to an end. It is permissible, but not just merely as that and kind of deceiving or coercing them into a certain situation. So MAPS doesn't claim that any action is fine, even if both parties agree to it, because one could be deceived or coerced. In that kind of situation, both of them have to be fully aware of everything that is going on, nor could they be coerced or threatened by anything else outside of there. Sexual actions are morally impermissible, or sorry, permissible or impermissible, the same way any action could be. From a moral perspective, there's nothing necessarily different or unique about sexual acts. They're all kind of treated the same way as any other moral act or dilemma. It's held to the same standard. So let's say if it's done in a tent or something weird like that, or involves, sorry, not, if it's just done in a tent, or if it were to involve homosexual oral, role play, heterosexual anal, it would be morally permissible with the consent of everyone involved, so long as no one is being deceived or coerced. So a little more about it. So one other possible scenario to kind of think about is, so let's say two people, A and B, discuss and agree to have sex. They go to person A's place where there's a camera. Person B sees it and thinks it isn't recording. However, what they do, it is actually filmed to be found later for sale. However, person B didn't know that the camera was recording. It would have refused with that knowledge, knowing that it was recording. Obviously, it's morally wrong, and the person was deceived. A should have informed person B about their intentions and the camera recording them. Now move on to Aristotle's virtue ethics. So one of his basic things is eudaimonia, or a sense of flourishing. It isn't just something that occurs in a single moment. It happens over the person's lifetime. It's not necessary to determine at any stages either in a person's life. Closer to the end of their life, when they know they're bedridden or they're on the verge of passing, I suppose you could say. Looking back, they would decide if the life they lived is one of flourishing, or if they had any regrets they may carry with them. So for Aristotle's virtue ethics, rather than having strict rules for how one should decide, he admits it's not an exact science. There's a middle ground, in a way. He evaluates a person's character judgments or their virtues that they hold. So one virtue, for example, is courage. It exists between cowardice and rashness. So let's say if you have a kind of situation, I guess, where if you're walking down the street and you see a burning building and somebody tells you, they have a kid inside the burning building, like there happens to be a lady outside in a wheelchair who obviously can't run, physically incapable of going inside and helping, ask you to help out. However, if a person doesn't know how to properly respond in the case of a literal burning building or where to go, he would say it's kind of the wrong idea to just run in head first trying to find the missing persons, whereas the firefighters and first responders are on the way. In that kind of scenario, you would be making the situation much worse. So for someone to act virtuously, they should have self-control or discipline. They can't act on every desire to self-indulge. So if you're going to live a eudaimonious life or one of flourishing, you can't necessarily always self-indulge, or I can't just eat chocolate cake all the time, even though I enjoy it. There's got to be a line to draw. I can't self-indulge my entire life. I'll look back and think so much time wasted, or how unhealthy I'd become after that. So a virtuous person has compassion towards those around them. So Aristotle does focus on the self and developing the self, but they also have an awareness of others around them. Another one of his virtues is the idea of liberty, or liberality, sorry. So it's a virtue of charity that one can give to charity, but not at the rate of giving more than they could afford. So again, it's all falls under the whole moderation of finding the middle ground in between, where we can exist, but not at the sacrifice of too much, or our whole livelihoods, I guess. So Aristotle's wisdom. So people aren't born with a perfect understanding of how to act and understand unworld conditions. We learn them over time, and it comes easier to us the more we practice things such as moderation. We can develop these virtues through practical wisdom. So again, I learned a lot of cultural norms and mores, as sociology would call it too, actually. But we begin to learn how to act, or what people appreciate, or what's best for us too, as we begin to grow and mature. So he uses a term called phronesis, practical wisdom, and he calls people that do have phronesis phronimos. I think I'm pronouncing that right. So to Aristotle, phronimos is a sage that possesses...
Pronunciation, sorry. Oh, that scared somebody to death. I hope not. Phronimos.
Phronimos.
Phronimos. There we are. All right, I'll shut up now.
No, sorry about that. Thank you, actually. So phronimos to Aristotle is a sage, somebody that possesses perfect practical rationality and worthy of emulation. They have a capacity for moral perception, sensitive to all the features of the situation, even if they don't use them in exact computation of what to do. So by features, he means, total awareness of who is involved in a certain situation, who it affects, who depends on what resources, other details like that here and there, various, there's no strict black and white to any particular moral situation. They would have to be aware of everything that's going on. So his virtue ethics doesn't focus on the action itself or the effects, but the person's character. So one case, let's consider lying for example. So utilitarian approach would say the only time it's okay to lie if it increases overall happiness or utility of people. According to the categorical imperative, it should never be done for a couple reasons, because you can't use someone else as mere means to an end. So that's part of deceiving somebody else into doing something that you want them to do for yourself, or so, and also, sorry, Aristotle's virtues. A virtuous person generally makes it like a policy to avoid lying best they can. Of course, that's nearly impossible all the time. Like you probably have little white lies here and there of, like let's say even if somebody were to ask you a question, and you weren't fully paying attention, you just say yes just to, you know, answer the question. Sometimes that would happen. So move on to Wolff's idea of moral saints. So going back to eudaimonia, it's the theory of human flourishing. So Aristotle and Wolff are both moral egoists, claims that people ought to act in their own self-interest. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to be selfish, though, or focusing on what's only good for them. As we'll probably see later on, too, what's good for other people is typically good for the person or us or ourselves, too. So she defines a moral saint as a person whose every action is as morally good as possible. That means we're always acting in constantly some kind of moral good. So there's two different distinctions that she makes. There's a loving saint tied with utilitarianism. So one acts for the benefit of others from a concern for their well-being. And then the rational saint tied with deontology, Kant's theory. One acts for the benefit of others from a sense of duty. So one thing to definitely think about is the overall scope of somebody being a truly good person. Wolff does say you can be perfectly wonderful, but still not be perfectly moral. That would mean, you know, every single action we take is always oriented towards some kind of moral higher good that would be aware of. Also, when she talks about saints, it doesn't mean, you know, the idea of a religious kind of saint. It just means that always acting in a moral way. Like every act is oriented towards a higher moral goal. So Wolff would say that pursuing a moral saint lifestyle is an incomplete ideal of human existence. So our existence in the world is more than constantly making moral choices. There's other skills people refine and ambitions we pursue. So, you know, there's the idea of art. She makes the example of food too. Of course, some people may be well aware that, or even firmly believe themselves that perhaps vegetarianism or eating animals or possibly, you know, mistreatment of animals in general is immoral, but may still choose to eat meat in their lives while they're still being aware of it. So if we were to follow the whole moral sainthood, like somebody that were to believe that mistreatment of animals is immoral, yet still choose to eat meat, it's still, you know, it's still doable to be like a decent person. So part of the perfect human life for Wolff is being eudaimonic. So it's not always geared towards being constantly moral. It's always geared more towards flourishing in the way that you want to flourish in a way. How we follow our values or interests or desires. So we all have our ambitions. You know, we all want to make the best sort of artwork or be the best at a certain sport. Whatever hobby we may have, we always follow those things in the pursuit of them. And I believe that actually concludes my slides. So I'm going to try to hand it off to Elaine now.
Well, wait, do you have any questions to answer?
Let me double check.
You are now unmuted.
Does anybody have any questions they want to post in the public chat, or I'm going to try to see if I can look at the private messages. I haven't seen any private messages. I'm not sure how I would actually check that.
It would be under messages, public chat, and then anybody you would have private messages with should also be listed there.
Okay, I'm not seeing anyone.
All right.
Actually, I did receive a question. Let me see if I can find it again. So I had somebody actually ask if Wolf would say if there's a way to know what's right or wrong. So she actually mostly adopts the idea of virtue ethics. While there's not exactly a clear-cut decision or way that she would define a moral action, more or less you probably follow the idea of Aristotle that it depends on the person and their characters or their intentions behind what they're doing.
All right.
Does that answer your question?
Did you get an affirmative or a negative from the person that asked?
I did, yes. Cool.
Cool. And any other questions before we move on to the second half of the presentation? At this point, you can just put it in public chat. You don't need to message privately, just because, you know, it's sort of open questions. Cool. All right. So I'm going to be talking about Mackie's error theory, Plato's Republic, and the social contract theory of Hobbes and Locke. Hi, my name's Elaine. Okay, so the thing with everything that Zach said is that it's all wrong. That's Mackie's basic position. So Mackie is opening up a question which is fundamentally about the ontology of morality. So again, big word, big scary word or whatever. But ontology, if you remember, and we've discussed this a bit, is the study of being. So it's about what sort of beings there are. So this is actually a term also in computer science, right? Where you can say that there's things like web ontologies, where what sort of computer entities do I have? But for our purposes, talking about ontology is sort of talking about what sorts of things exist in the world. So, my ontology would include physical objects because I believe that this cup exists. So when Mackie is questioning morality, what needs to be understood is that he's questioning what sort of beings morals are. So yeah, the questions that he asks is, what are morals? What makes moral statements true? And why should we follow them? So Mackie is, trying to overturn basically an entire branch of philosophy, or at least present an argument that it should be considered in a new light, or that it's useless. But with Mackie, or with the traditional understanding of ethics and morality, you sort of just think, okay, what's the right thing to do? You understand what the right thing to do is, and because it's the right thing to do, you are automatically going to do that thing. Right? So it's like, why should we do these things that we think are the right things to do? And this is actually a kind of complicated question, because it's sort of like this base understanding that we have that we should do the right thing because it's the right thing. Doesn't that seem circular? So Mackie's sort of questioning what sorts of things morality is. So ontology is, again, it's the investigation of being, ontos plus logos. Logi, logi is sort of like that thing they teach you in high school where it's like, oh, it means the study of. It actually means discourse. It comes from the Greek word logos. You'll see that a lot in philosophy if you keep reading it. I mean, probably not many people are going to keep reading it, but so to start Mackie's argument, he talks about two different sort of levels of moral views, and it's not really contributing to his exact argument as much as it is he's establishing this framework to say what morals are, what he is not saying, right? Like, so yeah, what he's not saying. This is terrible. That does not work. Okay, I was trying to use my drawing pen to annotate. It does not work. But yeah, he distinguishes between ethical views and meta-ethical views. So if you remember, we talked about metaphysics earlier. Originally, metaphysics, according to Dr. Green, was, filing instructions. Put this before physics because the subject matter of it comes before physics. Meta meaning above or before or what have you. So Mackie's trying to distinguish between two different levels of moral views. The first one's the ethical views. So these are things like it's right to do this, or killing is bad, or helping people are good. Importantly, he also says that something like the statement, moral statements are arbitrary, is itself an ethical view. Because you have to think, what are you actually saying when you say a moral statement's arbitrary? You're not talking about the truth value of a moral statement. You're saying moral statements are arbitrary, and so we shouldn't follow them. That last bit is the important part, and so we shouldn't follow them. That makes it an ethical statement because you're saying what someone ought to do. Mackie's not interested in these questions. He is interested in questions about meta-ethical views. So what are morals? He uses the term first order and second order. First order corresponds to ethical views, and meta-ethical views correspond to second order. So yeah, he is not saying that moral claims are incorrect because it's like, oh, look, people say that helping your neighbor is good, but really every time that you help your neighbor, an alien world explodes, so actually it's really bad. So you shouldn't help your neighbor. No, he's not saying that they're misguided or that, there's something wrong about following them. He's saying that moral truth itself, the very idea of moral truth, is crucially flawed. So he gives two different arguments for why moral truth is flawed, right? The first one is super familiar. I get this one all the time. Basically, any conversation on morality, this is sort of the baseline view. And it's an argument against morality, right? Because it's like, well, why should I do this? Right, so Dr. Green said all slides from today's presentations are on web courses, so if you want to follow along on your own. Okay, but the argument from relativity is, look, what's important about moral claims as well is you can have two different cultures with different moral claims. So Mackie is fine. Mackie is saying that, okay, so we look at culture 1 and they say that individualism is the most important thing. And we look at culture 2 and they say that taking care of the elderly is the most important thing. We have a conflict here, right? Or if we're talking about like this sort of rah, it's all me individualism. But we do have a conflict here. And the thing that Mackie's criticizing is this idea that morals are something objective, or like that they're true. So what's important to understand here is that in all of our moral judgments, we're sort of doing what Kant is talking about, where we're sort of universalizing them. So when I say that if I'm in a particular situation and I say that I should do this or I should not do this, I'm saying anyone in my situation who is faced with this choice should do this or not do this. Our morals are sort of implicitly universal, or they're implicitly objective. This is an issue when we have two cultures with different systems of morality. With the two cultures with different systems of morality, only one of them can be right? How do we determine which one is right? This is also a very imperialist idea. Mackie doesn't get into this because he's writing forever ago, but this is basically why this has become such a common position nowadays, right? We understand immediately that these sort of value judgments of this is the right thing to do, absolutely, versus someone else's, this is the right thing to do, absolutely, that emerge between cultures with different ethical systems, has been used as a way of saying, well, look, they don't have technology, so clearly their morality is worse than our morality because we are objectively better in every way. So there's understandably a wariness, but as far as a critique of morality goes, this is kind of an incomplete argument, because the fact still remains that all cultures do have some form of ethical system. So if you're trying to say what ethical system is objective, you can say that it is these ethical systems, like the very fact that we have ethical systems that prescribe action. This is sort of, you get this a lot with religion, where people will say, well, something like the Ten Commandments is in every culture, right? Like, oh, you know, don't kill or whatever. Because obviously, otherwise, you know, all the religions would say this is the objective moral truth, this is the objective moral truth, this is the objective moral truth, and we'd be in a mess, and there'd be no coexistence. We'd be killing each other. It'd be the Crusades all over again. So the second argument that Mackie talks about is the argument from queerness, unfortunately named argument, just in terms of how it's changed. I mean, it's a fun word, you know, but queerness in this context just means strange. Oh wow, this is terrible. Why am I? You know, I'm gonna go all in. Oh, okay. Well, what's important to understand is that Mackie is an empiricist. So remember, Mackie's trying to do an ontological critique of morality, right? I hope you don't hear my roommates in the background. Mackie's trying to do an ontological critique of morality. So I'm gonna actually open up a quick poll here. Custom poll. Oh God. Plato here. So if you guys can answer this question, which of the philosophers that we've covered is also an empiricist, that'd be great. I mean, you don't have to, I can't tell you what to do. But so what's important to understand is that Mackie's an empiricist. He's doing this ontological critique. So we have to understand what sorts of ontological commitments he has. Ontology is often linked to epistemology. Empiricism is an epistemological claim. It's saying that all knowledge comes from the senses. So with this, what sort of ontology, what sort of things would we think exists? Well, the things that we can sense. So if a moral view is true, it's knowledge, right? Or if a moral view is knowledge, it's true. Knowledge comes from the senses. So moral views would have to come from the senses. But this seems strange, right? Because, I mean, I can certainly say, oh, I feel like this is right, or I feel like this is the wrong action, but this is really different from like looking and seeing, oh, this is the right action, you know? If you play Dark Souls or something, it would be like, oh, this is the wrong action. You see the little blood specter rise up and just fall off the cliff, and then you're like, oh, let me not do that. We don't sense it like that. The way that we sense things is sort of this feeling like, oh, this would be better than this. Ontologically, this is a tough position, because it seems like we're getting a feeling, and it seems like we can sort of describe the sort of thing that we're feeling, but we end up with something similar to Plato. We end up with this like non-observable, immaterial object that is universal and constantly binding, and it is eternal and unchanging, like the eternal unchanging right thing to do. You can't perceive it, of course. Everything else in our senses we can perceive. Everything else in our senses, I think this is really the test. You can put it in a particle accelerator, right? Like you cannot put the right thing to do in a particle accelerator, because it's nothing like the other objects of our senses. Why should we admit that something exists that is so different from everything else that we think exists? It would be super strange. We'd have to come up with all sorts of reasons. Remember the pineal gland, right? Like, oh, this is how they interact? That's what you would get. It's not fun. So this is Mackie's primary argument. This is the one that he thinks is the most forceful. That ontologically, thinking that moral senses are true it sort of leads you to this something that's too ontologically costly. By too ontologically costly, I mean we'd have to change too much about how we understand the world. So Mackie comes to this final position, which is called error theory. Error theory is not saying that moral statements are meaningless. It says that everything's false, you know? So we should prioritize saving lives over restoring the economy. That's sort of the debate right now, right? That would just be false, straight up. The opposite position, also false. Anything that says you ought to do this, or we should do this, or this is the right thing to do, it's just false. It's not neither true or false. It's not meaningless. It means something, and what it means is it's wrong. So I'm going to publish the polling results real quick here. So 52% said Hume. This is correct. 29% said Kant. This is sort of correct. It's not really correct. You know, it's wrong, right? That's what something sort of correct means. But Kant does sort of he's responding to Hume, so he does care a lot about empiricism. Again, the question was, which of these philosophers that we discussed was an empiricist? Plato, dead wrong. He doesn't think anything is knowable from the senses is true. And we haven't really talked about Marx. So that was sort of like a trick question. Props to whoever answered that one. That one's also false. It's just he's like, history moves on its own. This is not okay. So we're gonna talk about justice now. This is from the band Justice. I'm not saying that justice is necessarily Christian, though there are certainly philosophers that would argue that. We're gonna start by talking about Plato. So this is about Plato's Republic. It opens like every single one of Plato's dialogues does. You know, they're messing around, and then the debate starts, and you know, Socrates is a bum. But the central question of the Republic is, what is justice? So he's actually mainly concerned with ethics. So for him, this is first of all a question of justice of the individual, right? What makes a person just? What must they do? How must they orient themselves to be just? And why is it better to be just than unjust? So the point of this is that for Socrates, his main concern is at the individual. Socrates is sort of an ethical thinker first and foremost, whereas Plato, his student, even though he uses Socrates as a mouthpiece, he's more of a metaphysical thinker. So Socrates, the ethicist, is saying that, you know, what does it mean for me to be just? This is a super Greek question. I can't imagine a question that's more Greek. I mean, there's probably a few, but so in sort of answering this question, these people are all providing an answer to what does it mean for an individual to be just. So it starts off by Socrates talking to this old dude that really likes him. He's really rich, but he knows he's going to get destroyed in this conversation. Since he's really rich, he sort of sees things like a businessman. And to him, justice is being honest and paying one's debts, right? So, you know, you pay me the money that you owe me. I pay you the money that you owe me. This is what we're going to be calling business ethics. Polemarchus is Cephalus's son. I'm sure I'm butchering the Greek pronunciation, but you know, it's a dead language for a reason. But anyways, Polemarchus says that justice is helping your friends and harming your enemies. Glaucon doesn't really propose a definition of justice, but he adds an important consideration. Glaucon asks us to consider, I'll go back to that. Glaucon asks us to consider whether people only obey what is just because they're scared of being punished. If a city is telling you to do this, you know, obviously it's more just for you to follow that, but you know, we're sort of always working with the background understanding that there's consequences to our actions. So the Ring of Gyges is a scenario where it turns you invisible. So this is actually sort of talking about the perspective that we had on the previous slide, which is Socrates is also interested in why should I be just? The Ring of Gyges is functioning here to say that any answer that Socrates gives has to not focus on punishment, right? You have to be just in itself. Justice has to be something desirable in itself, right? It's nothing external. It's not a reward. It's not a punishment. It has to be just in itself. Thrasymachus, he's really angry. He's the sophist, and he says that justice is whatever's in the interest of the stronger, presumably while flexing. So Socrates doesn't really like any of these. He thinks that there's something valuable in Cephalus's one and something valuable in Polemarchus's one. But Glaucon's isn't really a proposition, and Thrasymachus, Socrates is like, this is so bad that we need to get rid of it. Am I breaking up right now? Oh. I am? Okay, cool. Sorry, do you need me to repeat anything? I mean, I'm sure I was probably just rambling for most of it. There's also going to be a recording uploaded to YouTube, which will have audio directly from my thing, so we'll be able to go over it. Okay. Right. Yeah. So Cephalus, someone said eye for an eye. It's basically that, right? Eye for an eye. You do what you need to do. Okay. So Dr. Green asked me to mention this one. Polemarchus's definition of justice as helping your friends and harming your enemies is a definition from the Homeric epics, right? So the Odyssey and the Iliad and whatnot. I think that is an important point to bring up, just because these are not random positions. These aren't just Plato imagining like, oh, what silly positions could I have people destroy today? These are actual positions that were held and very common in Greek society. You know, being honest and paying your debts, helping your friend and harming your enemies, and in the interest of the strong. So how does he respond to these sorts of ideas? To Cephalus, he says that, okay, remember, Cephalus's response is being honest and paying your debts. So Socrates is not Kant. He thinks that if an axe murderer is at your door and is saying, tell me where this person I want to kill is, you should lie to them. A little bit of a wild proposition, you know, a little spicy, but Socrates does think that lies can be useful. I'm going to bracket this just an aside real quick. I'm going to say Socrates, but of course we're talking about Plato writing using Socrates as a mouthpiece. That has to be understood for a lot of the Socratic dialogues, not necessarily all of them. There's a few Socratic dialogues which are good representations of what Socrates actually believed. That's the consensus, but the Republic's not really one of them. But anyways, so for one, there are cases when you want to lie to someone, that when it's more just to lie to someone. And there are also cases when you don't want to pay back your debt, such as, you know, if someone's like, yeah, I'm going to hurt myself. Oh, by the way, that knife I lent you, can you bring that back? And you're like, why? And they're like, just do it. It's my knife. You know, you obviously don't want to do it for a good reason, because it doesn't seem like it's the right thing to do. It doesn't seem like it's the just thing to do. It's important to understand that just and moral, or just and right, are sort of conceptually similar or identical. In this time, there's not really too much of a distinction between what's the right thing to do and what's the just thing to do. A lot of that distinction, Nietzsche at least argues, comes out of Christianity. But anyways, so Socrates rejects Polemarchus's response. He says that the issue with Polemarchus's response, remember this is helping friends and harming enemies, is that, well, you know, sometimes I'm friends with really bad people, and sometimes I'm enemies with people that are really cool. And, you know, it doesn't seem right for the just thing to do to be helping the person that is, you know, that you're cool with, but he actually is a serial killer. It doesn't seem like the wrong thing to do, or it doesn't seem like the right thing to do as well is going to be, you know, punching a doctor or something because they spat on you in 6th grade, right? So your friends might be evil, your enemies might be good, in which case the first principle is not moral, it's not just. What's important to understand about this is that for Socrates, he's seeking sort of a universal principle, right? Socrates is doing the exact opposite of Mackie here, in that he wants something that we can objectivize, that we can look to and know that it's certain, and know that just because we understand how justice works, we are going to change our actions because we know. Literally, Socrates is pretty much exactly what Mackie was criticizing. So the issue with helping friends and harming enemies is your friends, your enemies, these are sort of matters of who you like. These are matters of taste. It's not a matter of reason. You don't reason your way into friendship. Otherwise, we'd all be friends with someone that's really cool. Like me. Okay, next slide. Socrates' responses, part 2. So Socrates talks about the Ring of Gyges scenario. Remember, this is not necessarily a proposition of a definition of justice as much as it is a thought experiment to sort of separate the consideration of what justice is, and to separate that from the consideration of why should we be just, right? To separate punishment from that. So the Ring of Gyges has a scenario where you put on a ring, you go invisible, you go around, you're punching people, you're, you know, having sex without their consent, you're doing all these different things. You're basically just doing whatever you want because there's no punishment. So Socrates comes to reject this because for him, when you're doing what you want, just whatever your base desire is because you have no fear of punishment, it's sort of like being an id, right? This is like Freud. It's not it's not the just thing to do. It's not proper. He says that the just person is better off than the person that's holding the ring. It doesn't matter the punishment or the lack of punishment. If you're just, you're going to be better off than someone who can just do whatever they want with no consequences. Because in doing whatever you want with no consequences, you're actually hurting yourself. You're acting against your best interests. Because what you want to do, or, you know, whatever passing fancy you have, like, oh, I'm going to take this ice cream cone and, you know, stick it on a baby or something, because that'd be funny. That'd be pretty funny. But the rationale is complicated. The just person's better. Like, doing that is not really in your best interest. You're sort of turning yourself into more animal than you are a person. I'm glad someone agrees with me. Okay, there's some breakage. Is it still bad? Or is there still breakage? I'm just picturing the baby with the like the cone sticking out like a little unicorn. It could be in a little onesie. I'd laugh. Okay. So, yeah. I'm going to be slowing down here just to make it easier if it does break up. Also, we are running out of time. Again, I did set the timer to 80 minutes. I set that at about 6. So if the call does suddenly drop, we're just going to remake it. So Socrates' whole argument can almost be considered as a response to Thrasymachus. He sort of dunks on Thrasymachus a little bit, but he does actually elaborate a further critique of Thrasymachus. It's sort of in the background of the entire Republic. But the dunking, the argument for that goes a little something like this. You know, say you meet Shaq, and Shaq tells you to cut off his arms or something, right? If you obey, you are not acting in their interest. Remember, Thrasymachus' definition is that justice is in the interest of the stronger. Justice is in the interest of the stronger. If you obey, you are not acting in the best interest of the stronger. Presumably, it's in Shaq's best interest to have all of his arms, you know, to be able to keep DJing. I saw him live. That was pretty cool. If you disobey, he's just going to beat you up. So you're not acting in your best interest. You're sort of stuck. If he tells you to do something that's bad for him, no matter what you do, you are acting unjust. This doesn't seem like a coherent principle of justice. So Socrates, like I said earlier, he takes a little bit from this, a little bit from that, and he's like, these little tidbits, you know, the rest of your argument's trash, but this is okay. This core of it. So from Cephalus, he says justice is the art of being a person, of being a moral, responsible person, of being a moral agent. So, yeah. And then from Polemarchus, he says that justice is giving each their due. So your friend is presumably someone that's good. Your enemy is presumably someone that's bad. You give the good people the good things. You give the bad people the bad things. Socrates goes at length actually demonstrating what these points are, but for the purposes of our class, we don't have time to get into that. What's important to understand is that he says that justice is the art of being a person and justice is giving each their due. These are sort of the definitions that he goes to flesh out in the rest of the Republic. So the thought experiment. It wasn't called a thought experiment at the time, of course, because there weren't really experiments at the time. But there were certainly thoughts, and this is a really big thought. It is a thought that a bunch of people are having for days. Their wives were very lonely. For Socrates, because they had to be stuck in the house the entire time, they weren't allowed out. For Socrates, the idea that justice in a person is the same as for Socrates, the idea of justice in a person is the same as the idea of justice in a city. So remember, he's saying that there's something objective that's both in a person and in a city. It's the same principle, but it's going to sort of have different forms. But it's a lot easier to understand what's going on in a city than it is to understand what's going on in someone's soul. We're all acquainted with cities. They're larger in scale, and sometimes it is helpful to sort of make a very large scale project, take something special from that, and then take that bit from it, just because it's easier for our brains to think of all the moving pieces when they're very large. So the rest of the Republic is basically just an extended thought experiment. They say, okay, let's make a city. Let's make the best city, like a perfectly just city. Okay, audio. Testing. Is it any better now? Every 8th word or so is garbled. Okay, I will make sure to say every 8th word twice. Wait, that would be every 8th word and then the 7th word and then, okay. So the rest of the Republic is basically an extended thought experiment. They're trying to imagine, okay, Calipolis or whatever.
Callipolis.
I was doing that so you didn't criticize me, and here you are attacking me during my own presentation. Callipolis is not what we would typically describe as a utopia. It's the perfectly just city. This is sort of why the Republic has remained a controversial text. Every generation has sort of rediscovered the Republic, and they sort of said, like, what am I reading? There's some good parts, but then there's some bad parts, and he's always had that ability. So the structure of Callipolis is that it requires a lie in order to be maintained. There's some parallels with Brave New World. So it is maintained on a lie. It involves a strict separation of classes. There's no fiction allowed. This is where it diverges from Brave New World, because there's absolutely a lot of fiction in Brave New World. It's ruled by a god king, and you can't raise your own children. But men and women are able to have equal offices. There's actually there's like a lot that's progressive going on. It's part of your office is determined by ability. It's like a nightmare, but it's also kind of good. What's interesting about Callipolis is initially Socrates is like, yeah, so we're just gonna get a bunch of hippies in the forest. We're gonna have like 10 people. It's gonna be cool. Everyone's just gonna work for the good of the community. No one's gonna really work for themselves. And then one of his interlocutors is like, Socrates, the city sucks. Where are my expensive rugs? You got to remember, all of these people are like slave owners, right? Where are my slaves? Oh, Callipolis is no slavery as well. That was what I was forgetting. Where are my jewels? Where's my sword? Where's my harem? Where's my delicious meals? And Socrates is like, oh, you guys want all that? Okay, but the rest of the city is going to be a nightmare. And it's basically a nightmare because of that. So don't ask for good things. That's the lesson of the Republic, or else you get terrible things. Anyways, so all this talk about the ideal city is sort of really, really abstract, in part, right? What's the point of this thought experiment? So we're going to move to something which is a little bit more grounded, which is why do societies exist? What's the justification for societies existing? So we're going to be talking about social contract theory. We have Hobbes and Locke. These are the two main proponents of social contract theory. Hobbes was born a bit earlier than Locke. I think they're both English. I could be wrong on that. But Hobbes was born during a civil war, and Locke was sort of born after that. I'm not too big.
They're both English, mate.
Oh god. Okay. So they attempted to create a theory to ground the legitimacy of state power. Enlightenment's coming around. Everything has to be questioned. Just saying God did it, it's not okay anymore for some reason. A lot of this could be traced back to economic roots, and having all this money flowing in and having paper, which you get from China and all that. But people are writing letters, people are arguing about everything, and the need comes into play to say, okay, we need a way to ground this idea of a society, because soon we're about to argue ourselves into anarchy, and that's never worked out. If we conceive of justice as the same principle in both humans and the state, we're forced to ask why the state has the right to do certain activities which any person would be condemned for. So, the police pull you over, and they beat you up or something because your car smelled like drugs or something. And they beat you up and they throw you in their car. Someone pulls you over on the side of the road and they weren't a cop. This would be a terrible thing. This would be awful. But since they're a cop, they are allowed to do this. Why are they allowed to do this? What's the reason, right? Just saying, well, because God said that the kings are here, and they're the kings for a reason, right? They don't do that just based on smell, but okay. Anyways, so this idea of the legitimacy of kings sort of grounded the legitimacy of the state for a long time. God said the kings are here for a reason. So the kings can do anything because it's ordained by God. But now we're asking, what are the morals for everything? So what are the morals for going around and killing people, or putting them in our basements, or forcing them to pay us money? All of these things. Why can the state do these things? So to this end, they ask us to imagine what life would be like without a state. So without a state, there'd be no laws, there'd be no police, there'd be no borders. It'd be like a John Lennon song. There'd be no welfare, there'd be no labor laws, there'd be no rights. Anything goes. And you just get beat up all the time because there's no one bigger or stronger around that's going to protect you unless you pay them money. Does this actually apply to life without a state? No, right? You have to remember that these people are born, I'm not going to say during the height of British colonialism. Okay, yeah, the call is about to expire. But these people are colonial. Like, they're born in an environment, they're living in an environment where, going to Africa and enslaving a bunch of people is perfectly okay. So they don't really have a high view of the savages or the primitives. But essentially, state of nature does not have to literally mean nature as much as it means just what would it be like without the state, or what would it be like without any social organization. And the state protects us, right? If someone is knocking on our door and they have a gun, we can call the police, and the police are going to show up with their guns, and then we're going to have a gunfight or whatever, and yeah. But the state of nature exists, or not the state of nature, the state exists to protect us, because without the state, there's nothing that grounds our behavior. There's no consequences for our actions. This is literally the Ring of Gaiju scenario. Without the state, we are in a situation where everyone's essentially holding the ring, except, instead of having absolutely no consequences, they can also kill each other, which is perfect. But basically, this sucks. So since it sucks, people don't want to live in it. And because they don't want to live in it, they decide to get together, pool their resources, and decide who gets to call their shots. And we're going to call this a social contract. So it's called a contract because there's a give and a take, right? You join a contract and you agree to have interest or debt, and you get something now. Or you join a contract and you agree to have a job, and you agree that you're going to show up at these hours. You are not going to be able to keep what you make. People get to order you around, but you do this because you need money, because starving to death is worse. So in the same way, the social contract is basically saying, well, we have a state because without a state, everyone would just go around killing each other. In the same way that, why do you have a job? Well, if I didn't have a job, I'd die, right? So you're giving up something. You're giving up your freedom to be wherever you want at this time. You're giving up your freedom not to have, someone tell you what to do. The key difference, though, is that at a job, you are presented a contract. You literally sign it, right? In your agreement or whatever, your W-2 forms, or it's taxes. I understand. Okay. The social contract is not a literal contract, as opposed to a job where you do sign a literal contract. It is an idea. It's justifying state power. So what matters is not, do a bunch of people get together and sign a contract, and do I consent to this contract? As much as is it reasonable to sign the contract? Because if it's reasonable, then we can say that since reason has this like universal tendency built into it, this universal compulsion to do what is reasonable, we can say that everyone automatically signs this contract. This, for one, grounds state authority, and for two, it justifies the state to reason. This is the key point of the Enlightenment, is that we're trying to justify things to reason. Kant's critique of pure reason is reason's critique of reason. A lot of the word reason. But this is sort of also why sovereign citizens don't really make a lot of sense, because they think that there's actually a literal contract that you sign, and you can get out of it because it's actually a fake person that is subject to the right. It's really weird. But anyways, so Hobbes and Locke are not the same. They have different ideas of what the state of nature actually is, which lead them to have different ideas of natural rights, the rights that you have from being human. So Hobbes says that life in the state of nature is absolutely terrible. I think this speaks more to him than it does anything else, but he thinks that without a state, people would literally just be roving around in bands and killing each other, and like you see someone has an apple and you just shank him for an apple. He's obviously never looked out into the natural world, because this does happen sometimes, but we don't really see wolves or something just attacking each other constantly, and it's a consequence of this is that if the state is attacking you, okay, so Hobbes thinks that the state of nature is just nonstop violence. It's basically Mad Max. All the state owes you is security. It's just a way, like, the minimal condition for a state is you not being exposed to the state of nature. So a consequence of this is that if the state's no longer providing you with security, if they are attacking you, then you're back in a state of nature, and the state is not providing you security anymore. So it's breaking its end of the contract. So now you are free. You are in the state of nature. Of course, you've been willingly giving up your freedoms. You've been rationally giving it up. So you're back in a terrible position. You're not well, and you can do whatever you want now, because the state's attacking you, but it's justified for you to do whatever you want, but the state's attacking you and you're going to die. So Locke, on the other hand, has a different conception of what the state of nature is. He thinks that, people are fundamentally good or rational, or like, whatever. He certainly has a better view of human nature than Hobbes does. So we retain from the state of nature certain inalienable natural rights. So from the state of nature, out in the natural world, we have liberty, we have property, and we also retain the right to go back to a state of nature. So we have the ability to end the contract. This is, of course, the doctrine that America was founded on. Locke's theories were very important for the American Revolution. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, property, or whatever. But yeah, that's essentially it. That's the end of my slides. Does anyone have any questions? So, does Plato give reasoning for why acting morally to others is in your own self-interest? It seems like a leap. Plato, remember, thinks that justice is the same no matter where it is. So, the idea of this is that, remember, Plato doesn't think that acting morally to others matters because of the consequences. That's the point of the Ring of Gyges scenario. He thinks that what's important to understand is that for the Greeks, justice is a part of your character, right? It's not just how you act, like you can be just. What makes someone a just person? Plato thinks that a just person, first of all, Plato thinks that the soul is divided into different parts. A just person has a proper balance of these parts. So being a just person entails acting justly to other people, but before that, it is about an internal configuration, an internal ordering of your soul. So not doing whatever you desire. This is, again, the Ring of Gyges scenario. He thinks that in the Ring of Gyges, you're letting your appetites and your desires do whatever you want. You're not thinking, you're not reasoning about what to do. Because of this, you are going to do things which are not in your self-interest, because your self-interest is not a matter of fulfilling all of your desires. It's a matter of what's good for you, which can only be understood through reason. So it might be my desire to go out into the living room and eat the 5-pound bag of Sour Patch Kids that my roommate bought from Sam's Club, but it is not in my best interest to do that. My body doesn't know that, but my mind does. So you can say that as long as I'm acting justly to myself, or as long as I am a just person, as long as my reason is prevailing over my appetite, I am going to do things which are better for me. The just person is better off. Do we have any other questions? Or does that satisfy your question first of all, and then after that, do we have any other questions? Right, so yeah, it's not acting morally to others, it is being a just person. That entails acting morally partially, but they have a complicated understanding of what morality actually is back in the ancient Greek days.
Just to pitch in really briefly, that it is honestly a genuinely complicated matter. And the Greek opinions on ethics it's a matter of like legitimate intellectual inquiry to try to square them with contemporary notions of morality. So yeah, if you are confused by that, you're definitely not the first or the last person to look at what Plato is saying and wonder how at the end of the day it's all supposed to fit together, because he honestly does seem a little bit blithe or untroubled by it. One thing that Elaine said, actually, that reminded me of something that I didn't say in my own presentation. We haven't learned about Plato's theory of forms yet. Once we do, you might notice a certain feature of them. With this feature, it would actually totally make sense that Plato thinks that at the end of the day, there is no real conflict between anything good. There couldn't be a conflict between what's good for me, good for you, good for the city, good for the universe, etc. He thinks it all has to be unified and fit into place. His argument for that is very abstract, but I should probably just say that that's a reason why he might seem less because he seems really unconcerned, I think, even to a lot of his own readers, like the Sophists, represented by Thrasymachus, are real figures who represent opinions roughly like Thrasymachus's, and so they would think Plato is entirely pie in the sky and out to lunch. But yeah, his metaphysics help him in that way. I didn't emphasize that in the lecture, but yeah, there is that. All right, I'll shut up.
You are now unmuted.
No, yeah, that's a very good point, and I think that this sort of brings us back to what Mackie says at the beginning, which is the ontology of morals, right? Our ontological commitment. So first of all, our epistemological commitments give us ontological commitments, which give us moral commitments. A lot of jargon here, but essentially all that means is what we think determines what we can know, determines what sort of objects we think exist, determines how we should act. And this is sort of Plato's idea as well, because he thinks that, only by sitting around and talking to each other and ignoring our wives can we actually get to actual truth. And because of that, he thinks that it's only the forms which ontologically exist. And because of that, he thinks that knowledge of the forms entails that you're just going to act morally. So it seems like there aren't any other questions.
Yeah, that seems more than sufficient for one day. So I hope everybody really enriched by our first attempt to do this online. I'm going to go outside for a state-sanctioned reason. If you have one, I would recommend that you do that too. Everybody have a good one. Test on Tuesday. So.
All right. Cool. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming out. Go run around in your parking lot, Dr. Green. Have fun. And everyone.
They actually do let you run outside. The state is not a question. So somebody did point that out to me. So thank you very much. Have a good one, everybody.
All right, y'all. This is over. I'm gonna stay here until everyone leaves. If anyone else has any questions or just wants to say something or whatever, I'll be here. But yeah, I'm just gonna wait. So, okay, this is an important question. I'm going to be uploading the view from my end onto YouTube, and we'll be distributing that link. It's probably not going to be super good recording, just because I had to change the settings before I found some that worked. But if you go to the conference pages of web courses, probably like an hour after this conference ends, because it's a really weird system, I'll upload some screenshots for how to actually look at it and see what's going on. But this conference will be listed as having finished. If you go to the drop-down menu of that, you will be able to play the conference in your browser. So it'll be posted in the conferences tab, and it'll also be posted on YouTube, and we'll distribute that. And I'll upload screenshots of how to find the conference. I need to get new caps. Yeah, normally I have not very verbose slides because I talk a lot, but I wanted to have verbose slides because this is an online course, so I figured it'd be more useful since people probably haven't been doing the readings and watching the lectures or whatever, to have more written information. Insidious Homo sapiens who have learned the dark arts of tool making. I'm actually not sure what Hobbes and Locke's moral stance is. It's probably something close to Plato. You gotta remember.
Locke actually has a small theory for natural rights, for like a moral theory. Locke actually believes that to basically maintain morality, you have to respect everybody's rights. I don't remember exactly all of his rights off the top of my head, but I know for sure one of them is autonomy, like the right to choose, the idea of liberty, the minimum requirements for one to live a happy life. Sorry, I didn't mean to take that away from you, Elaine.
No, you're fine. I would say though that Hobbes and Locke are sort of writing in an era where the question of what is the moral thing, like the question of these moral theories, is not really super useful, because there is a moral theory which is accepted, and it is do what the Bible tells you. That is the moral theory. We only really start seeing the proliferation of ethical theories when later on, like utilitarianism is sort of like, we have Kant that has an ethical theory, but that is also sort of grounded in God. It's not entirely separated from God. And then we have utilitarianism that comes along, and then Aristotelianism that's sort of been revived. But the key point is that, we only really start seeing this investigation of what the right thing to do is, or what sort of grounds the right thing to do, after the death of God, after Nietzsche says that God's dead. Because then we start saying, oh, well, I mean, if the Bible isn't valid anymore, like, how do I determine what to do? Right. Or if the Bible's not reasonable, I guess that's the key point. Got it. And thanks for asking a question. All right. So it's been a bit. I am about to go. I'm going to stop the recording. And yeah, I'm going to end the call. Later, everyone.